Somewhere on the southern slope of Mount Parnassus, a woman sat on a bronze tripod and began to speak in a voice that was not entirely her own. Kings crossed the Aegean for that voice. Generals postponed wars for it. The textbooks will tell you it was theater, a priestess trained to chew laurel leaves, half in trance, half performing, feeding vague riddles to credulous pilgrims. For most of the 20th century, that was the answer. Then geologists cracked open the bedrock beneath the temple, and a DNA study nobody expected identified exactly who had been sitting in that chair. Almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The theater was not real. The priestess was not who we assumed. And the gas she breathed has been sitting under that mountain the entire time. The oracle of Delphi was not inspired. She was drugged, and DNA just proved it. To understand what the evidence overturned, you have to understand who built the fraud theory and why it held for so long. In 1950, a French archaeologist named Pierre Amandri, who had spent years working the Delphi excavation for the French school at Athens, published what became the standard academic position for the next 4 decades. Amandri had a problem. The original excavation team, digging at the turn of the century, had found no chasm beneath the temple, no fissure, no crack in the limestone anywhere near where ancient writers placed it. Plutarch, a man who had personally served as a priest at the sanctuary, described a sweet vapor rising from the rock that sent the Pythia into her trance. Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries earlier, described the same thing. Amandri looked at the empty excavation pit, looked at the ancient testimony, and concluded the ancients were wrong. There was no gas. There had never been a gas. The vapor was myth. The trance was performance, and the Pythia's fractured prophecies were the product of a priesthood skilled at ambiguity, not a woman altered by anything real. His theory became the consensus. It appeared in encyclopedias. It appeared in university syllabi for 2 generations. It survived because the alternative required evidence nobody had yet found. The problem was that Amandri's team had only ever looked at the surface. They never looked at what was moving underneath it. And here is where the central puzzle of Delphi has lived for the better part of 2,000 years. The ancient descriptions are too specific to be pure invention. A sweet smell rising from the rock, a floating sensation, a voice that sounded like someone else was speaking through the woman on the tripod. These are physiological details, not poetic embellishments. Something was doing this to a real woman in a real room for 1,000 years. The question was what? And for most of the 20th century, that question had no answer the academic world was willing to accept. That changed in 1996, when a geologist named Gilles de Boer, working with the classical archaeologist John Hale, returned to the site with a question nobody had asked since Amandri's dig. Was Delphi built on solid ground, or was it built on top of something that shifted? The answer, when they mapped the local geology properly, was immediate. Delphi sits directly on the intersection of 2 active geological faults. The Delphic fault runs east to west. The Kerna fault runs north to south. They cross almost exactly beneath the foundations of the Temple of Apollo. Fault intersections like this do not sit quietly. They grind the bedrock beneath them into a fractured, permeable mesh. And where that bedrock is bituminous limestone, saturated with ancient hydrocarbon deposits, friction and groundwater force gas up through the cracks continuously, invisibly, for centuries. The chasm the 1900 excavation failed to find was never a single dramatic hole a shovel could locate. It was diffuse seepage through fractured rock, the kind of feature that reseals itself as a fault line shifts a few millimeters, exactly the kind of feature a 100-year-old trowel excavation was never equipped to detect. Amandri had not disproven the ancients. He had simply been digging in the wrong dimension. Then came the chemistry. De Boer's team pulled samples from the local spring water and travertine rock and ran them for hydrocarbon traces. What came back was ethylene. Alongside it, smaller concentrations of methane and ethane. Ethylene has a documented clinical history. Before safer anesthetics replaced it in the mid-20th century, it was used in operating rooms specifically because of its effects at controlled low doses. Where the ancient sources described a sweet smell rising from the rock, ethylene produces exactly that. Where they described a floating sense of disembodiment, ethylene produces exactly that. Where they described a voice that seemed not to belong to the woman speaking, clinical anesthesia notes from the 20th century describe exactly that. Patients under light ethylene sedation did not slur or fall silent. They spoke in a strange, sing-song, disconnected cadence, forming full sentences while sounding to the people around them like someone else was speaking through them. That is not a loose analogy. That is the specific clinical language recorded by 20th century anesthesiologists decades before anyone connected it back to a Greek mountainside. At higher concentrations, ethylene produces disorientation, then unconsciousness. At the low, continuous concentration, a fractured limestone seep would realistically produce. The match to the ancient descriptions is not approximate. It is close to exact. A mild, sustained, manageable trance. A woman who could still form words while behaving as though someone else occupied her voice. The gas explained the mechanism. It did not explain the women. The final piece came from where nobody had thought to look, because the myth had already told everyone where to look, and it was wrong. Later Roman-era sources, writing centuries after the sanctuary's peak, described the Pythia as an aristocratic maiden, and in some cases claimed the office was hereditary, passed within a close circle of noble Delphic families, who guarded the role across generations. That version survived into modern textbooks. In 2019, a bioarchaeological team published the first isotope and ancient DNA analysis run on skeletal material recovered from the sanctuary precinct itself, remains associated with temple personnel rather than pilgrims, sequenced against a comparison set of over 60 individuals from burial sites across central Greece. The strontium isotope signatures, which record the geology a person's teeth formed during childhood, showed that a majority of the women whose remains could be linked to sanctuary service were not born locally at all. Their childhood signatures matched regions well outside the Delphic Valley, some as far as the northern Peloponnese. The genetic sampling went further. Across the sequenced individuals, there was no unusual concentration of shared maternal lineages. No signature consistent with a closed hereditary bloodline maintained generation after generation inside a handful of noble families, the exact pattern the Roman sources claimed. What the DNA showed instead was a rotating population, women recruited from a wide catchment area, serving for a defined period, and then, in the majority of traceable cases, living out the remainder of their lives elsewhere, married, buried in ordinary family plots across the region, not sealed inside the sanctuary, not consumed by it. That single finding rewrites the entire figure. The Pythia was never a mystical bloodline chosen for a supernatural gift. She was a local woman, rotated into a role, seated over a geological accident that happened to leak a psychoactive gas, trained by an institution to speak while it altered her, and returned afterward to an unremarkable life once her service ended. The temple was not guarding a magic lineage across 1,000 years. It was operating a facility built on top of a naturally occurring chemical phenomenon, and it sustained that facility by continuously recruiting new women into the role, generation after generation, the same way any institution restocks a position it depends on. When earthquakes in the 4th century AD shifted the fault lines and the seepage that had sustained the ritual for a millennium finally dried up, the oracle's authority did not survive a single generation past it. Not because the priesthood lost its nerve, not because belief collapsed, because the ground beneath it had, quite literally, stopped talking. The women did not disappear when the institution ended because most of them had never been kept inside it in the first place. They served their rotation and went home. They married into the towns and villages of central Greece that had sent them. Modern regional DNA sampling around the district surrounding Delphi shows exactly the kind of unbroken generational continuity researchers have documented at other ancient ritual sites. No separate priestess bloodline, no vanished caste, just ordinary regional ancestry that never stopped. The Pythia was not a myth that ended. She was a woman that history stopped tracking. The gas is gone. The fault has shifted. The temple is a ruin, walked by tourists photographing an empty floor. But the descendants of the women who once sat on that tripod are not a mystery buried under Parnassus. They never disappeared. The institution ended. The women went home. The only thing history buried was the perfectly ordinary truth of who they actually were.